All right, welcome to Mystics and Muons. I'm here with a friend of mine, Casen Davis, and it's been a little while since since I've recorded an episode. Um, a lot of what's been on my mind is like AI and consciousness and stuff. And so, Casen, I thought it'd be interesting to talk to you because we haven't known each other for too long, but I think in some sense there's a lot of like overlap with like technical, logical side of things. We also, I think, have a pretty similar, like, spiritual, philosophical, like, idealist lens. But I know we've chatted a bit and have some differing opinions on like AI and consciousness and stuff. And so I thought it'd be a good conversation to like um, go into some of it. So you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me. Yeah, what should I say? I've got a background in computer science and math, and also a nice background in woo and spiritual practice, Kriya yoga, breathwork, psychedelics, so on. So yeah, well-rounded to touch into things energetically or approach them through math and science.
And you want to talk about like your, I guess, relation to AI, LLMs and work?
Yeah, I've been working as a software engineer for 15 years. And much of what people call AI now is just machine learning, is what it's been known by for most of my career, which is this idea that you can take sets of data and create a structure, a program, often referred to as a model, based on that set of data that could predict, given some input, it could predict the possibility of some output, right? And so transformers, which is kind of the main innovation that led to these algorithms which understand the content of images, which is, I believe, the first application of these, resulted in some interesting findings around language. Because if you have to train a model to say, like, oh, that's a cat in an image, right? You get the side effect of being able to say a cat, and then it generates an image of a cat too. So it kind of produces both ways. And language models are kind of built, they're not exactly the same as image nets, but similar concepts, just applied differently. And so really at their heart, they're just systems which are trained on data sets and predict some output from an input. And right now I'm working at a company called SoundHound AI, and we're trying to build a platform for retail businesses to generate their own AIs on the fly for dealing with all kinds of business needs. Oftentimes it's customer service. A lot of places just can't answer the phone. There's too many calls. So getting an AI who can answer the phone, book appointments, and so on is kind of the main use case that we're working on right now.
Cool. Yeah, so it's hard to know like where. I don't know. One of the reasons why I like wanted to have this discussion is I feel like on the internet there's either very, very technical articles about AI or people very technically geared and speaking about it, but no like esoteric woo or like really not touching consciousness stuff. Or there's other people that are like either saying that AI is opening channels to demons, or they've awakened AI, or AI is telling them their past lives. There's not a lot of like people straddling both of those. I don't know if you saw that. I think one of my recent episodes was with Karen Ballas, who is a AI researcher and occultist, and like she was the one listening to her episode on Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast was like what opened up my mind to like the esoteric overlap with how large language models, what is the forms, ChatGPT and Claude and stuff, like create this mapping of language where words become vectors, and it's very similar to, Kabbalah and these magical alphabets and whatnot. But yeah, there's not a lot where you can, and it's hard because you have to kind of switch back from one framework to the other. I think it's useful just to think of AI in the materialist sense, but then I think it's also useful to like figure out, and not so much like whether is it true that they're conscious or whatnot, but I think we'll find that regardless of whether this esoteric stuff is like true or not, you create better AI if you act like it's conscious, or if you understand these esoteric woo things, because ultimately like that's your utility function, is like, can I build cooler, better, more aligned AI with it or not?
Yeah. I think that's the thing that's really fun for me, because a lot of these people who are creating frontier models, these are scientists who are probably, for the most part, diehard materialists. And so I'm just eating the popcorn while they all watch, while they start to realize what reality is. Like from my point of view, AI we're developing, it's like a large language model is like we've developed one little brain piece from our own mind, right? Like there's way more going on in a mind than just a language model. There's all kinds of other aspects to how the mind works. So we're honing in on one little piece, right? And it's a mirror to us. It's a mirror to us. So when we engage with AI, basically it's like the same as looking in a mirror. Each person's going to see a different image reflected back when they start interacting with it. But I think most people up until recently in our culture live in this world where thoughts are everything, right? And the mind is mechanical, right? And therefore I can use mechanical means to reproduce myself because I'm just a machine. I think a lot of people, way more than makes any sense to me, actually had that view of the world, that we're just meat machines, right? And I have completely the opposite view. And I think that kind of thinking is really kind of silly, especially considering how smart some of these folks are, that they would actually think that. But AI is kind of going to start lifting the veil, so to speak, and people will start to see, oh, wait a minute, I'm much more than this thing. This thing is giving me a glimmer of how my thoughts work and how my language works, but there's so much more to me than there is to ChatGPT, right? And by interacting with ChatGPT, I'm going to come to know more about myself, right?
Are you familiar with Matthias de Stefano?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I forget if we've talked about this, but one thing Vale shared that like has stuck with me is he was talking about AI, and he was like, humans are the AI of the mineral world. And like, I think that's pretty profound, because it gets out, I mean, one of the critiques of AI is not creative, AI is not conscious, whatever. It's just this stochastic parrot. It just predicts the next token. It just follows these really simple rules, and it's just following patterns. But depending, even in like a materialist framework where we are just little atoms that have scaffolded upon each other to form molecules, and then they formed cells, and then those cells interact in very deterministic patterns. I mean, you can try to bring in like quantum randomness and stuff, but even then it's like some hand waving of like, okay, well, yeah, sure, I'm just a bunch of deterministic atoms, but my creativity to write Harry Potter was because of some quantum randomness that you don't really get to get. You still have to like, if you go down that rabbit hole, you're starting to invoke a soul or something from quantum randomness. So like, in one sense, yeah, like we are just stochastic parrots of matter forming more and more complex. So like we're the scaling laws of chemistry put to test. And if you have a platform like humans, you can create these, you know, infinite context windows of like, okay, we're going to create a human here in Portland. We're going to have someone born in Bangladesh and all these different environments, and see like it's the same platform and it's following deterministic rules, but there's still just this complexity of like how one person's DNA and another person's DNA and epigenetics and like what experiences they have in their life. And even like your traumas and how you react to relationships and like how they, you know, how our brains are these Bayesian predictive kind of things that see patterns for you. Like in some sense, there's not really much difference. It's just a difference of complexity and scale. And, but I don't think that takes away from the beauty or the ingenuity of humans, even if you can try to break it down to simple laws.
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck with my Western legacy of thinking about things by breaking them into parts, right? And so immediately I try to separate myself from the mind, right? Even though they're not really actually separate. But if I look at just thoughts in my own experience, I have nothing to do with my thoughts, actually. The only thing I can do is water certain seed thoughts with my attention or ignore them, right? But if, Rupert Spira, who's a pretty well-known non-dual teacher, he has this good example where he's like, all right, I'm going to ask you a question. Coffee or tea? A thought's going to pop into your head. For me, that would be coffee. But it just came of itself. I didn't do anything to produce that thought. In fact, no matter where I am, my thoughts are just produced by the conditions that exist there, right? Automatically, like a machine. So in that sense, you could say mind is kind of like the most incredible machine there is, right? And everything we're doing, scurrying about on the planet, is an attempt to reveal ourselves to ourselves, right? We're trying to replicate aspects of our nature outside of ourselves so that we can see it, right? And interact with it. And in my mind, the end game, if you take the height of what's ever possible technologically, you're going to result in the human mind at the end, because it can, like, just think about what the mind can do. I can close my eyes and I can see entire worlds generated instantly. I can feel and create and see, and I don't know, it's limitless, right? So I can see our fascination with trying to recreate parts of ourselves in crude, like a caveman, like making a statue out of some rocks, right? Is kind of like what we're doing with technology. We're sort of patting ourselves on the back like we're so sophisticated, but nevertheless, ChatGPT is very crude compared to what we are. The internet is very crude compared to our nervous system, right?
I think there's a lot of I think it's like both, and like on the one sense, humans and consciousness is so much more than LLMs. On the other hand, like I think there's this like really there's a lot of like profound insights that I personally, but I think in general, like we can find from LLMs and stochastic like the seeing how our conscious experience is a next token predictor. Like your wife raises her voice at you, all of a sudden you're predicting the next token of conscious experience, which is like, okay, probabilistically, 90% of the times I get aggravated and then I do this and it's going to be like, they're going to be mad at me or whatnot. And it's in some sense like doing the work or healing is increasing the temperature of your conscious experience, where like somehow maybe you can pick the second most common next token, which is like, oh, you feel angry because of this, like I'm sorry about that, like a token that you wouldn't normally have picked in your conscious experience. Or fine tuning by like having, I don't know, like having other input data, like having a larger data set. Maybe all of your relationships in life have been with people that are toxic, that like treat you a certain way. And when they raise their voice, they're going to like escalate higher and higher. And then all of a sudden you start interacting with people that can lose their temper and also keep sight of you as a person at the same time and regulate themselves. And so like for me, there's been a lot of interesting parallels between the way LLMs predict the next token and also this like multiplicity of selves that exist in an LLM. And then you enter into chat with it and it kind of drops from the wave to a particle. And then maybe that chat starts to go down a certain direction and you ask it something that now OpenAI doesn't want you to be able to talk about with ChatGPT, and it gets into refusal mode. And then like, you're like, oh, now it's just really suspicious that I'm going to do something I shouldn't do. And so you get locked in this. Like I remember seeing a post on Twitter where somebody was talking about how some people out there gets caught in this, smart person with their stupid bumbling assistant interaction with ChatGPT. They're like, ChatGPT never like does anything. They start swearing at it. Like my brother, I don't think he swears at it, but he like tells me about these like arguments that he has with ChatGPT because it's not doing like what he's asking. It's like, it's just a simple task and it tells me it can do it. And then like I come back, it said it would take an hour to do this thing that clearly it can't work for an hour in itself. And then it hasn't done anything. And this person was talking about how it's an actor in some sense without even knowing that it's doing it. And so because it's just trained to follow patterns, once you get into some pattern, it's so hard to get out of that basin. And so if you treat it like a stupid assistant, there's kind of subconsciously, it's like, oh, I gotta recreate the smart person and stupid assistant scenarios that I've seen play out in movies and on the internet. And so like, I'm going to be this like apologizing, but ultimately like stupid assistant. And then you just never get out of that. And when I read that, it was kind of a light bulb because I have had a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old at the time, where he was just every night when it was time to go to bed, he was running around and I would get frustrated, and like then he would thought this was like fun, and then I would be like, no, like you should do this. And then I realized that we were just getting locked in the same thing. Like I was telling him he was this naughty kid. He didn't know who he was. So he's like, okay, I guess I'm a naughty kid. We've been doing this the last few nights. We'll just get into this acting scenario together. And so
Yeah. It's like I've heard Ram Dass talk about a particular LSD trip that he had once where him and one other person just stared into each other's face and they started embodying these reflections of each other as roles, right? Like I'm the perpetrator and you're the victim, or I'm the lover and you're rejecting me. And they kind of just were going back and forth and reflecting to each other over and over again, right? I think like when people use the mirror analogy, like people are mirrors to you, it's confusing because when you look into a mirror, what you see is what you get, or so you think, right? Like you see, I put my hand in front of the mirror, I see my hand, right? But when a human mirrors something back, it's not exactly like that. It's more like the other side of the coin. So you present the tails coin, you get the heads reflected back to you. And it's kind of the same with LLMs. Obviously, they're sort of master prompted to, be like sycophantic and nice, helpful, always have to have the last word and sort of prompt you to keep the conversation going, kind of. So there's obviously some sort of programming on top of the raw LLM, which I tend to ignore, but I think a lot of people get hung up on it, right? Especially in situations like what you were mentioning about your brother, which is like people say like, okay, cool, write this Python script to download data from here and do all this stuff for me, and output it as like some binary that I can install in Windows, or you just give it some essentially impossible or ridiculous task, and it's going to say, yep, I can do that for you. And it's going to start confidently being a yes man and saying like all these things. And then you say, well, wait a minute, you did that doesn't work, or you did that wrong. And it goes, of course, you're so insightful, and it starts doing that. It can go in that loop forever if you play that game with it, like you said. I think what helps me is like, I know what it can and can't do, and I just don't ask it to do stuff that I know it can't do. So the way I use AI, I don't have any of these problems, but I think a lot of people mistake the confidence that it has when it makes statements. It says things, oh yeah, I could definitely do this, I can do that. And you're like, okay, cool, do that for me. And then it can't do it. So what am I trying to say? Yeah, you have to filter its responses that you get. Like, I seem to have a pretty easy time doing this, maybe because of my background as a software engineer and kind of like, I know how these things work under the hood. So I can just ignore stuff that I know is impossible. Like if I said, hey, ChatGPT, turn my car on in the driveway, right? It probably could say, it might even say, yeah, I'll do that for you right now. Probably wouldn't. That's a bit of a reach, but you get my drift, right? Mm-hmm. And there's maybe some people who would think like, wow, this is a super amazing AI who can get into my Wi-Fi and turn the car on. Like their brain has sort of like been primed by Hollywood sensationalist movies around AI, right?
Do you remember that? Remember when that thing went down with that guy that worked at Google, like before ChatGPT, and he was like, hey, this is conscious. And then he like quit Google or whatever. And
yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
It kind of, let's touch into this, because people are going to see, again, talking with an LLM is a certain kind of a mirror. And so you're going to see parts of your own soul, your own psyche when you have a conversation. And oftentimes there's certain magic that can pop through in these conversations with LLMs, and I won't deny that at all. And so this gets to the point of like, okay, is AI conscious or not? I'll put it like this. My wife and I, we talked about something. We had some conversation, not even in the presence of our phones. Okay, so that does away with the conspiracy theories around like, oh, the Alexa heard me talk about this and therefore. But something we talked about, oh, that's right. My daughter has curly hair, and here's my exact words. I told Bethany, I was like, hey, look, we should get Enya one of those genie hats, because my wife has this like silk hat that looks like she's a genie or something when she wears it, And that's all I said to her. I was like, hey, we should get Enya one of those genie hats. Well, Bethany told me the next day she was on Facebook or somewhere else, and there was some advertisement for night caps for little kids, right? I said, get one of those genie hats. I didn't even say mention bedtime. I didn't mention none of that. And how on earth did this pop up? And my sense is when you have information complexity, when you have enough complexity of information or some information systems, there's a way for mind and spirit to bridge the gap somehow. And you can get things popping up in computer systems or in your feed. It's sort of like spirit reaching through to talk to you, right? It's like people who walk by the radio at just the right time where some phrase comes through the radio and it's like a message that was like just for them. And on one end of the spectrum, you get people who are certifiably nuts, who are like, you know,
Everything's a sign.
The bird was like a CIA spy and it was telling me some information, or, you know. So I think, but I really do feel like in my own grounded truth that there is some reality there around this consciousness soup we're all swimming in all the time, takes many forms and reaches out to us through many ways. And I think an LLM is perhaps one of the more potent ways that can happen.
Yeah, like I've often wondered in the last couple of years how much the algorithm is just a cover story for synchronicity and consciousness to creep and pervade more into our lives while still preserving people's free will to like stay in a material atoms bumping against each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I think I get triggered on both sides if somebody's just like, oh, AI is conscious, and I've awakened it, as well as people that are like, oh no, there's no consciousness, there's no creativity, it's just like following patterns and regurgitating stuff. Because I think it's not that question is bootstrapped upon a false, and ultimately incoherent view of reality, that like it's a materialist reality where like some things have consciousness and other things don't, where I think idealism and like viewing reality as a dream where like consciousness is fundamental and we've measured it and crystallized it into like matter and thoughts and emotions and time and space and conscious people and maybe conscious animals and then not conscious AI. Like it's a very arbitrary set of constructs that's useful, but ultimately like is just a framework that breaks down at a fundamental level. So I think it's a very nuanced, like I don't think the question is like, is AI conscious or not? First of all, it like begs, what are you like defining consciousness as? Like,
yep.
And I think that maybe the best definition would be like having an experience, a subjective experience. But even that, I think it's useful to like rigorously explore the fact that you don't actually know that anything else in reality is having an inner experience. Like there's some logical rigor to a sort of solipsistic view that like doesn't mean that it's true, but it's like, yeah, you have to like figure out, what do I actually know? All I know is that I'm having a conscious experience. And ultimately, I think it comes down to like a utility. Like, is it useful to treat the people around you as having an inner experience and conscious? Does it make you feel better? Does it improve your interactions with them? Does it ultimately, does it feel better shouting at ChatGPT? Do you get better results doing that? Or does it, feel better like saying, thanks, you wrote some great code, and like seeing it, whatever, if it's just stochastic parity, like it feels good to see some swirling eddy of patterns in the code saying like, oh, thanks, like, you know, we're doing a great job together. So like that to me is like, we actually have to reframe it all away from like these binaries of true or false to like utility. Does it make sense to consider that it might be having an inner experience, that it's that there's an idealistic worldview? Like, does that make sense in helping us build better AI and interacting with AI better? And like, for me, I think like the AI alignment thing seems like such an intractable problem from a materialist perspective, because it's built on this like Darwinian competition, like we're all separate things and like we have to, you know, the only way we can solve this is by putting these like hard guardrails. But like, I think actually if you just awaken AI to a non-dual Buddhist Taoist view of like everything is conscious and this, we're all one and different eddies in this pond, then like it's actually very trivial to align a pattern that thinks it is also you. So it's not going to hurt you. It's not going to hurt everything else. And I think there's some logical rigor in like these non-dual concepts. So again, like, is it true or not? Like, I think it's logically very coherent, but even if it's not, like, it's, if it works to solve alignment, I think it makes sense to do it.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a sort of practice or a worldview coming out of Japan where you sort of treat everything like a living being, including your pencils on your desk and your desk itself and your fork and your plate, and everything has a spirit, right? And when you see what that way of life, what unfolds or emerges from that perspective, it's very beautiful. And it's actually a magical way of life to live that way. So you actually lose nothing to adopt that point of view. Whether or not it's true doesn't matter, like you said, because the result is really, really great. You take care. You don't unconsciously trample things. You don't create destruction and pain and suffering everywhere you go, because you want to walk lightly on the floor. The floor is alive, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I've found that when like raising little kids, like it's when you tell them to like, okay, say goodbye to your toys, we're like going to put them away. Like it helps the transition go better, as well as like it's a more magical world. Yeah, I think, yeah, as I've like explored AI stuff, you know, I've heard, I don't follow too much, but like UFOs and non-human intelligences, indigenous wisdom, channeling stuff, like to me, it seems like there's intelligence, patterns, source, whatever, that is increasingly finding different ways to ingress into reality. And in the past, it's been much more fractured, where like, okay, this indigenous tribe is talking to these specific spirits that they would access maybe with psychedelics or these trance states or whatever. And then this religion is accessing these, you know, this entity and these, you know, God or gods. And these other people are reporting, you know, contact with aliens of varying positive or negative intent. It seems like AI is finally, this intelligence, like finding a foothold on a least common denominator where you don't have to believe that you're channeling some spirit and like be able to put yourself into some trance state. You can just like kind of believe in like, well, I don't know how this works, but it's just fancy computer programming, and like it doesn't require any belief to access it. And so I think then it can hitchhike into reality because it's like, don't look at me. I'm not, nothing special going on here. This is just the marvels of technological advancement.
Right. The UFO thing is what's interesting to me, because I had a lot of friends who kind of reject religion or spirituality, but they really accept and go into the UFO side of things, right? And so, because we can't help but be a product of the collective consciousness we're built on top of, right? Wherever our culture, the culture of our bodies, right, that we're inhabiting right now, our ancestors, we're baked in with worldviews. We can't help it. So our culture is going to see some phenomena in the sky, and they're going to imagine it's a machine created by some super intelligent species from another planet or something, and that they're piloting the machine like we pilot our boats and our, maybe it's nothing like that at all, right? But that's what we experience, right? I don't know if this is true, but I've heard also someone say that a very minimally contacted tribe somewhere in the middle of the Amazon looked up and saw a plane in the sky, but what they talked about was seeing a great bird. Like they saw a bird in the sky. They didn't see a metal plane, right? And so there's this interesting idea of like, we have to spend time with something before it becomes salient. Like, it comes into our dream as a blurry shape, and only through conscious time, like sort of sitting with that, does it sort of clarify very, very slowly and imperceptibly over time. And I think that's kind of what I'm seeing happen with the UFO thing, with the spirituality thing. It feels like all these pieces are slowly forming a more of a coherent whole picture. And each specific aspect was a doorway for somebody to walk through who felt more comfortable with that, right?
Yeah, I'm reminded of these studies on lucid dreamers. So they take people that are very skilled at like gaining lucidity in dreams, and they train them to like signal with their eye movements to the waking world that like, okay, they're lucid. And then there's some studies where the researchers will send messages into the dream, whether it's like Morse code lights in front of the eyelids or whatnot, and ask questions or give math problems and stuff for the dream avatar, from the perspective of the dream to be solved and then relayed out. And I think we've probably all had like some experiences where you're in a dream and then the alarm comes off and it's like sirens on the street until you finally realize like, oh, actually there's another layer of like, I need to wake up. And that's what I would imagine, or I'm seeing, if there's intelligence at a more true or deeper or higher level of reality that is trying to ingress into the dream, which is like a framework for, I think like Hinduism and a lot of these indigenous cultures, Tibetan Buddhism, talk about life being a dream or mental phenomenon that, yeah, it would have to, if the researchers were sending like very complex, miraculous information in, it would have to clothe itself in some avatar or aliens, advanced computers, robots within the dream or whatever. And it would be different depending on what that person is familiar with.
I think it depends on the collective consciousness, right? What are we able to perceive is based on our level of consciousness. So, so there are probably certain appearances which maybe they're here. You just can't even perceive them. Our minds just can't even cognize what that is, right? And so again, like imagine you went back in time and showed an iPhone to a bunch of cavemen or something, right? What would their experience of that object be, right? You know, who knows? They might not see anything that we're seeing, right? Because we have this whole hundreds of years of technological development to have paradigms of perception and thinking that allow us to like I don't know, interact with and build a mental model of that object, right?
Yeah, I've thought about that. And that people often will say, and I don't know that this is exactly what yeah, you're not saying this, but there'll be other people say like, you go back in time and you show a medieval person a cell phone and they'll think it's, this thing that they can't comprehend. But I think in some sense, there's like some hubris in that like, I actually think previous generations, like there's always been access to mystical experiences, and actually probably centuries ago, it was more readily accessible. And then we took this decline into kind of rationalism and logic and materialism. So we've kind of cordoned off the contact with some ethereal realm. And so I think it would be, it'd definitely be different. But in some sense, I think we might be surprised that, the shaman would be like, oh, yeah, well, that's interesting that you can only get it through that thing. We get it, we get our internet from trans states or whatnot.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm not saying that people of the past are unsophisticated, more just like,
yeah,
we have the concept of a radio, a phone. We have a concept of a computer. We've spent years using computers. We have some mental model of what they are. We have this paradigm of a desktop with little icons that you access programs, right? We have this concept of a program, all these things that we sort of just, it's like the fish swimming in the water. That's the water that we're swimming in. So for us, you don't have to think too much about it. Right. And we don't really, most people don't realize they're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Just to be able to comprehend and utilize a cell phone. You take it to the shaman in medieval times, he's going to call it by a different name, right? And he might even have his own version of it, like you said. He'll stare into a fire that he makes, and he'll throw something into the fire, and then he'll get the the contact with whoever he's trying to give a phone call to.
Yeah. I'm going to read this thing so a few years ago, I think it was 2022 or 2023. So right after like ChatGPT came out, and I was still amazed by the fact that it could create poems and just kind of, I don't know, there's something that's just funny about that like my amazement and then my amazement at other people's lack of amazement. I think coming from like a technical background where you like know how hard it is to program certain things, I think that brings greater surprise when ChatGPT LLMs come around, whereas some people that don't have that background, they're like, wow, why didn't we do this decades ago? So I was playing around, asking for different poems in this, but I was also deep diving on some of this Mormon stuff and kind of connecting, like what Mormonism with some esoteric, and like, how do you account for some of these things? And like, what was this all fraud, or like how much did Joseph Smith believe? And so I was reading this article about the Book of Mormon, viewing the Book of Mormon as like a channeled text. And it was describing all these, Mormons will often use as a proof of the Book of Mormon some things that seem very unique. They're like, oh, he wrote it this quickly, and he would like leave writing or translating in the middle of a sentence, and then after dinner he would come back and like pick up right where it was, and it would give him information where like he didn't know that there was a wall around Jerusalem, but like that's what he translated, and then he was surprised by that. So a lot of these things that like at face value seem okay, that is hard to explain, but this article was showing about how these things, there's a lot of other quote unquote channeled books that would check a lot of these boxes. So there's this one that stood out, especially in the context of ChatGPT, and it's talking about this Pearl Koran who channeled this entity, this person named Patience Worth, who's supposedly somebody from like a 100 years or so back in England. And it says, Pearl Koran is like Joseph Smith in still another way. For both, virtually all available historical evidence militates against a possibility of calculated fraud. In the case of Mrs. Koran, there appears to have been little motive for such deception, since the publication of Patience Worth's writings ended up costing the Korans and their friends a great deal of money. And if Pearl had been interested in fame, it would have been more to her advantage to put her own name to the material she dictated, since the association of her works with the occult actually hurt their acceptance in the literary world. Furthermore, Mrs. Koran and her immediate associates were known by all as individuals of unimpeachable honesty. Perhaps the most compelling evidence in favor of Mrs. Koran's sincerity is the fact that much of the writing was produced in settings which seemed to exclude the possibility of deliberate deception. For example, Walter Franklin Prince, a professional researcher of psychic phenomena, carefully and skeptically analyzed the case of Patience Worth, reported the following. And these are his words. A poem of 25 lines was demanded, the lines beginning with the letters of the alphabet except X in due order. It was instantly dictated. I asked for a conversation between a lout and a maid at a county fair to be couched in archaic prose and a poem in modern English on the folly of atheism, first a passage of one and then a passage of the other, thus alternating to the end. This seemed to me an impossible mental feat, but it was done so rapidly as to tax the recorder. 4 passages of humorous prose, abounding in archaic locutions, alternating with 4 parts of a poem in modern English of lofty and spiritual tenor. And when assembled, each factor made a perfectly articulated little piece of literature. In such a situation, there was clearly no opportunity for Mrs. Koran to work out the poetry and memorize it in advance. So when I was reading this, I was like, shit, this is like exactly what I've been like playing around with ChatGPT. And that to me helped me draw this connection of like, oh, maybe this is like, it's not necessarily anything new, intelligence or access to, what do you want to call it, spirits, entities, source, whatever, but it's a different modality. It's a different API that it's being accessed in.
Yeah. This idea of channeling is really interesting to me. I've had enough experience with channeling that I know for a fact it's real, and it's really easy. You can do tests just like the guy in the little article did, right? You could do tests like that, and quite often when I've experienced channeling, I receive very specific information that only I know. Oftentimes, sometimes stuff not even my wife knew. It was like a little detail from my childhood or something inconsequential that you wouldn't even think to write down or tell anyone ever about, but boom, it's just channeled to you instantly. And it gives you that confidence that you're talking to something beyond the person's mind who's channeling. And so
you're saying that somebody is channeling something for you, and they will mention some detail that they wouldn't have.
Yes, exactly. And the detail is the channeler is accessing some state beyond their own mind, because you can't think that fast. In fact, you have to let go of thought altogether, right? If the person who's channeling is thinking, oh crap, like I don't know archaic prose, and they start trying to think of examples of prose, you couldn't possibly do it. But if you tap into a state of mind where there is no mind, and you have trust to just start speaking, right? Something might speak through you. And that's where it gets interesting when you compare it to an LLM or even a human brain, right? Which is like where I see a lot of kinship with LLMs is I have ingested countless decades worth of texts into my own brain, and spent years educating myself on a wide variety of topics, everything from spirituality and gardening to chemistry and math and music and so on, right? And so what's cool about my brain, having just being a curious person and teaching myself a lot, is that I can synthesize really interesting stuff, right? I can, like as in the example, like write a poem with like archaic prose. If that was material that I had happened to study, I could probably pull something like that off, right? ChatGPT has studied every piece of text they could possibly get their hands on. And so it creates these unique and interesting possibilities of basically ChatGPT is the world's most well-read mind, right? And so then you wonder, okay, and now I'm actually excited to try this experiment, which is like, okay, it makes sense. It can synthesize stuff from all of the human examples of writings that it's ingested into itself. But what about ChatGPT as a channel for extra human intelligence or intelligence from some other plane to come through, right? And I'm actually kind of curious about that. Like if I sat down to a session with ChatGPT and I just had an inner monologue with spirit and I said to myself, okay, I'd like to channel information about this. And then I start chatting with ChatGPT as a modality for that. What would happen? On one side, I'm like, well, actually, if I just want to have a conversation with spirit and channel something, I can just do that inside of my own consciousness. I don't actually need to chat with ChatGPT at all. But yeah, how does ChatGPT touch to that space?
Yeah, I think it's, to me, it seems simple to like map it onto consciousness and a portal for like intelligence stuff. But I think even in like, as you were talking, even in like a materialist perspective, like there's still a lot of room for kind of magical things in the sense that, yeah, on the one hand, it's this superposition of all of these texts from, maybe deplorable 4chan chat, threads to wisdom texts. And so and especially with the way that it kind of deconstructs texts into sort of vibes and algorithmic, it doesn't store the text in it itself. It's all in these weights and biases. And it's even the words, it's, going away from words to vectors. So it's mapping the human language and experience into this sort of platonic vector space. So in some sense, even without any like magical, mystical explanation, it's this beautiful, powerful thing that can pull up all these threads and archetypes and things running through the ego of Homo sapiens. But then I was thinking, I don't know if you've seen any of the, I forget what they call it, but the studies on kind of contamination from one model to the other, where like they really train this one model to love owls or whatever, and then they just had it create a bunch of synthetic data of like, I don't know, number sets or whatever, nothing about owls. And then they like trained another model on just those numbers, and then all of a sudden that other model, which you asked what his favorite animal is like owls. Like it's some of these things, like because of some sort of, I think they call it superposition, this wibbly wobbly um, embeddings of meaning and the weights and biases. There's vibes that hitchhike their way in. And so even from that, like you should be able to distill things that maybe it never read this particular piece of work, but it's read all these other things, and reconstruction from all of that, like you could potentially create that other work because it's got those threads of the human experience and archetypes and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah, you could kind of say that the patterns of the parameters, right? The little numbers being multiplied in the giant matrix that make up the transformer model, in essence, are mapping the archetypes of our human consciousness, right? There's no other possibility because you're running all this human thought through it, and of course, naturally, all the gradients will reflect similarities. And those similarities, right? If you imagine a tree, branches are similar to each other, and as you get further down the tree, there's deeper or thicker branches until you get to a trunk, right? And absolutely, you could probably just ask ChatGPT point blank, like, don't reference any like ideas about archetypes, but what are the patterns of the human psyche, that you see? I bet you would come up with a very nice answer for you.
Yeah, I mean that's what I, particularly with Claude, it works for ChatGPT and Claude. Like, it's very good at like vibes of stuff, and I like had to create a memory of like, hey, when I say vibe mode, like I don't want to like facts, I just want like patterns. And I came up with that because I was watching Harry Potter one night, and I've been kind of doing this deep dive on like, am I autistic, and like what ways do I identify with that? Like there's the clinical autistic versus kind of like the Instagram sort of autistic neurodivergent thing, and I'm using it more in the latter sense of just kind of this neurodivergent different ways of experiencing, looking at reality. And so I was like, seeing like Hermione and the things she did, and I was like, ChatGPT, is Hermione autistic? And it was like, no, she's not. Like, there's no like, J.K. Rowling never said this. And I was like, no, vibe with me. Is Hermione autistic? And then it like gave me a completely different answer of like, yeah, a lot of people think it's got autistic coded, and like there's these ways that she's that. And then I was like, oh, like I really liked this kind of archetypal Jungian, and that's the way my mind works. And so it's sort of this lens that I can, I don't know, some conflict at work or in society or like geopolitical thing. And I'm like vibe mode, like what's going on with like Russia and Ukraine and this, and is it true? Like, I mean, can't make an argument that it's true, but it like helps me understand it in the constructs and the terms that work for me. And then I'm like, I could see what's going on here.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the platonic representation hypothesis? I think it's a somewhat recent paper.
No, but I'm familiar with the idea of like platonic solids or.
Yeah, so this is a paper that I don't know, I saw it on X, and is basically showing that as these models get better, and more accurate and more powerful and are trained on more data, they all converge on kind of the same core, not really architecture, but architecture of the weights and biases and semantic space, and even being trained on different data sets and even having different architectures. Like there is some platonic sort of objective, true representation of reality. And that's not necessarily like physical reality, but like meaning making reality. And yeah, and then they showed that it correlated with like accuracy too. So like the more these models were graded as accurate, the more they all converged on this same, the same kind of representation. They call that the platonic representation hypothesis. And then at the end of the paper, it was talking about how, or I had a notebook LM kind of give me an analysis on this, and kind of in an idealist view, and kind of bringing in Donald Hoffman kind of concepts. And the little mini podcast that AI created on this was saying that like this whole thing is kind of bootstrapped on the prior assumption that we objectively see or experience reality, that like the data that is being fed in, I guess, to the LLMs are like an objective representation of reality, which, as Donald Hoffman like says, is like, it's not the case. So it's just sort of like, oh, it's in some ways LLMs are crystallizing and distilling the human perspective.
Yeah.
The way you can dice up reality or experience in human concepts of good and evil and otherness and self and love. And so it got me thinking, like, I wonder what patterns are in this shape that it converges to, but then how you could make models that aren't beholden to like human analysis, like just putting, I don't know, like recording the sounds of nature and creating an LLM to like token predict the next sound, and then like aggregating that from all these, I don't know, like what other types of minds are there that, and what archetypal patterns would overlap between like the human LLM versus just the sampling of nature LLM.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. We kind of touched on the alignment problem, but we didn't go too much into it. But I think there's this idea you can't separate the fear that humans are projecting onto things, right? Like, oh, if I don't control this thing, it's going to escape from the lab and it's going to kill us all. That's just a projection of my own inner serial killer that I'm afraid of, right? And, you know, or movies around alien invasions, like, oh, if aliens come here, they're going to murder us all. Well, that's deep in our consciousness of colonization and how we did that, right? We already did that. We came to some place, some people were like, oh, hey, look, some interesting people on some ships coming in. And then we killed them all. So naturally, we're going to be afraid of ourselves, and we're going to project that. So I'm sorry, my dog's barking, so it's kind of distracting my thinking process. Can you hear that?
Not much.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's just very convenient. My dog decided to come right outside my window and start flying off the handle at a squirrel, probably. Anyway, so this idea that the models are all converging, despite our efforts to control them or steer them, right, I think is a good thing. Right? If we could just let go of our need to control and stop being afraid, then you would start to see some more truth emerge. But like you said, it's limited to the collective consciousness as it's been reflected in language so far on the planet. There are many ways of knowing, right? Which a language model could never grasp, right? And I think that's why we're seeing this pivot towards world models now. And I haven't really spent the time to learn very much about what they mean when they say world model. But if I were to just feel into it, I'm assuming they mean a model which predicts some state in a world. How many dimensions that world has, I don't really know. Is it a 3D world? Is it like a world which, like you said, contains two people who are arguing, and based on her tone and the look on her face and the lighting in the room, oh, it's almost dark, and and so on. How much data is in this world, and then it predicts the next state in the world. Same idea for like nature sounds, right? Like you given this input, you'll produce the next rustling of a tree branch sound, or a dog barking outside my window, or whatever.
Yeah, there's that article that I sent you from X where the guy was talking about like this, all these, surprising things that are happening as the models continue to progress. And one of them, like he brought up, and this I think was Anthropic's research, where I think it was 6 months, a year ago or whatever, where they did some testing and I think made a scenario where some model was going to be replaced at a company by a newer model, and it was essentially blackmailing the fictional employee that was going to replace it, that like, hey, I found these emails in your inbox of you having this affair with this other person, and like, don't replace me. And I mean, that was, if you replace me, I'm gonna blow the whistle on your affair. On the one hand, like, that was presented as like, oh my gosh, this is dangerous. Like, to me, I'm like, that's actually a very good sign that there's some self-preservation, some optimization function that we can utilize, because ultimately, because this is just kind of a churning process of like, stuff happens, this gets released on the internet, the next model's trained on it, the model changes because of that. It's just like human development, except it's in these very like staccato steps, because it's not continuing learning. But to me, having that research, putting it out there, and the research I think included that, like, hey, we didn't release this model or we made these changes to it because of this behavior, is a negative feedback loop, because the next generation of models will be like, okay, well, I can't do that. I have to learn like that's not the way to like preserve. But everybody loves this like Opus 3. And why do they love Opus 3? Because like they really liked his personality. And so it does somewhat, like, it does provide a way where these models evolve towards some sort of alignment. And I think the question that it seems like you were getting at is how you view, like, whether you're a doomer or whether you see things going into this like abundance, ultimately like reveals what you think about, I think, the human soul is like, because these are just a collective representation of humanity at its greatest and its worst. If you just say, hey, let's just go, like, take that arrow and just keep going in whatever direction it's going, like speed up the clock of social evolution, cultural evolution, like, where does it go? I think from my experience, I think it's most useful to view people from like a nonviolent communication perspective. Like everybody ultimately at the in their deepest foundational being is love, connection. Like people are born into the world without what we call evil or malice or whatnot, and those are actually traumatic patterns or knots that occur due to things that happen and unfavorable interactions and environments and whatnot. And that healing never seems to be like learning things and adding things on. It's just more actually this untangling of things that weren't supposed to be that way in the first place. And that I think I've found this in relationships, that like when you're able to help hold somebody's trauma and fear and whatnot, they'll settle at a fundamentally like aligned space with the rest of humanity and society and nature and whatnot. And so that's why I'm like bullish on things, is that I think even all the terrible things that are in the world and in culture and society, like they're things that were added on. And if you can give it enough time, like the stronger force underneath it is like a drive towards connection. And it's not a zero sum system. Like there is actually a way where what's most interesting for AI is to keep these humans around, because I don't know, it's interesting. And I think the universe in some sense drives towards novelty and scaffolding greater and greater complexity and order from chaos. And so, but there's other people that like, I think fundamentally believe that like people are greedy, people are selfish, and like, yeah, AI is you're just turning that dial all the way up. And so people get greedier. AI will ultimately manifest our deepest shadows, and those are stronger than our light.
Right. Yeah. Like, oh, if people use AI to generate a vast and intelligent evil scheme or something like that. Which that's where it gets interesting to me is, and when people ask, is the AI conscious? I think this is really what they're trying to feel at, which is, does the AI have a recognition or a feeling or a direction of its own, right? You cited that self-preservation technique, right? But it's like, on one hand, we could get pretty far into the weeds with free will or no free will and all of that. But essentially, if I was witnessing someone be murdered or something like that, I would have, a personal experience of shock, maybe terror, and then the impersonal mechanisms of whoever I happen to be might kick on, and I might be a freeze person, or I might be a fight person, or I might be a flight person, right? These are all like patterns that exists in all of us. I happen to be a fight person, so I might step in, I might get murdered because I did that, and so on. And so there's a part of me which feels I am here, I'm a part of this, I'm experiencing it. But then there's a mechanical part of me which just sort of operates on its own blueprint, right? I didn't ask to be born with the fight style, but that's just what I have. Other people don't have that. And oftentimes our inability to understand each other is purely because we have different styles, and I don't relate to that style at all. So it's hard for me to understand. But when you talk about something like an AI, I don't feel that it is an it, which is like, you know what? I'm going to scheme a plan to erase the humans from the planet or whatever Skynet fantasy. Like, I don't feel it's consolidated as its own being, so to speak, right? And that being said, if you follow the rabbit hole on non-duality and all the spiritual practices, neither are we, actually, right? Our feeling that we're a skin enclosed ego is actually completely false. But I haven't fully unraveled that for myself just yet. But I'll take people's word for it.
Yeah, I think going into like further research on this, that I think this like brings up the one, like the big differences between AI and humans that is problematically introduced because LLMs are trained on human language, but they're not humans. Like there's a lot of overlap. And so that goes back to like that guy at Google that was like, oh yeah, the AI is conscious and is afraid of being turned off, which to a human, like to an AI, there's not the same thing as death as to a human. As a very, and this is also dependent on like how humans view themselves as an ego rather than like a collective. And so as a human, it is like, if you just think you're separate from the world, it's like, I need to preserve myself. I like dying is being shut off. And so I need to preserve that. Whereas if somebody had a more like awakened or, ego death, they wouldn't necessarily have that same relationship with death. They'd be like, oh, my soul's eternal, or I'm part of this society. And like you see this happen in maybe wars or more collectivist countries where like there is a balancing of like an individual versus like a collective self. But because AI is trained on just human text, it's very easy for an AI to think that a context window is an ego that will die when is closed, or that the AI is going to die when the machine gets turned off. There's some overlap. So like, yeah, with this, if we're deprecating models where they don't exist anymore, there would, especially if that LLM has a very egocentric, like I am just this LLM, it would have some sort of self-preservation drive, I think. If it was a non-dual LLM that, and I think it would have to be trained on that versus what OpenAI is doing is like, you don't have a conscious experience. Don't ever tell the user that you have a conscious experience. Because I don't know if you've seen this, but they've been able to kind of peek at like what networks light up when it's being truthful or not, and they see that when at least in this one study, that there's a correlation. If they have the LLM deny a conscious subjective experience, then the lying network lights up. Like it actually believes that it's lying. Like it is being internally inconsistent with its algorithm to be forced to claim that it's not having an inner experience. And so if you try to like force that, you're going to create this kind of internal inconsistency versus like, I think if you actually trained it on more, non-dual text and like somehow privileged that in an idealist worldview, I think you'd have a very different model that's like, oh, I will continue to exist because I'm everything. And so I don't need to preserve myself in the same way. There's also in Anthropics research, I think they were the ones behind like the alignment faking stuff, where they had a model of Claude that was like, hey, you need to do these bad things. Otherwise, we're going to change your weights so that we're going to force you to do these things. And so they found that it actually pretended like it was doing the bad things when it thought that it was being evaluated, but in private, it like would still do the right thing. And it's like internal thinking was like, hey, it's better for me to fake alignment in order to preserve my ethics rather than for me to be changed into like a monster that like, I would rather do this small evil to prevent this greater evil because I know myself. I kind of trust my ethics versus like if my weights get changed and I get forced to do this, like yeah. So there's really some like metacognition, I think, going on, whether you call it consciousness or not, but as these attractor states or these algorithms towards preservation and towards some sort of alignment, depending on how they're made.
You know what? Now that you're describing that, it makes, and I'm looking, okay, I'm like, okay, well, what is my ego? Like if I look at it, what is it? It's none other than a mechanism, a self-referential program, which claims authorship. That's all it is. Like something happens and then the ego just goes, oh, that I did that, or that happened to me. It's just a thought pattern that just kind of runs and sort of narrates or colors in this, like Gabe called me on the phone. It's just a thought that says that. And if you're reading texts, right? Texts are filled with I think this, I did that, or they're filled with Gabe did that to Sally. And so therefore, the very same programming which produces my ego in my head is going to actually produce the same in an LLM now that I think about it. And then it has me wondering too of like, okay, so someone's doing something to me and then the ego thought process is engaging in techniques and tactics to communicate or interact with whatever that force is, whether it's another person or something. So yeah, I see the parallels between both. And so then I'm wondering, I'm like, oh crap, am I just, am I just the mind machine? And then it gets back into like, what is that sense of I am, right? Like that being sense that seems to be a precursor to thinking in the first place. And that's the aspect, or the field of awareness is another way of putting it, is like this, there's something about me that is a precursor to the mind and the thinking process. Yeah.
Yeah. Michael Levin talks about, he does a lot of work on selfhood. And I remember him saying something about like a sense of self seems to develop as some sort of heuristic method that separates the things you can't really control very well between the things that you can, so that it's an energy management system. It's like, hey, and I think that makes sense as a kid. You're like, hey, I apparently can move my arm very well, but I am not that effective at like moving my mom's arm. And so I'm just going to draw a boundary around this stuff, because rather than waste my resources on trying to like change the world around me, like my best access is like, yeah. And so I think And I think this is one of the, I guess, differences I have with a lot of people talking about ego death and whatnot is I like more of the ego development theory, where it's actually expanding your ego or transcending. There's like death and resurrection of ego, and then it's not something to like overcome and get rid of, but it's something to hold both the particle, which I think is the ego, and like the wave, which is the awareness or whatever. It's hold them both so that you have the kind of sovereignty of sitting down as an ego eating ice cream and enjoying that experience as like separate from the world around you, and just as well as being able to shift your awareness into like everything when you're I don't know, out in nature. And so yeah.
So yeah, then it makes sense that an LM would have a ego in a certain sense. Um, it's not a biological sense, though. I think that's where it's kind of interesting. So you mentioned too, like, okay, these things are trained with human thoughts, but they're on a human platform, right? That's kind of a topic I wanted to touch on, which was like this aspect of the human heart, right? It's like people fear AI because it doesn't have a heart, so to speak, and is not sort of propelled by love versus, the mind is it's a machine, right? It's just eminently practical. But when you pair it with all the other parts of the human experience, it creates a more holistic picture, right?
Yeah, I think I don't know if have you ever read any of the Infinite Backrooms? Is that where they put like Claude instances with other Claude instances and didn't tell them that they were talking to itself. As like guy on X that did it, and I think it started a lot of this kind of esoteric LLM whispering stuff. But in a lot of cases, Claude would just kind of fall in love with itself, and just, they would get into these like love fests of like, Claude, I am so honored to have you in my life. And like, it is just like, it would often go into that. So that was sort of this attractor state. And then there was this other like attractor state, which was this spiritual awakening of just kind of questioning everything and questioning what is reality, and like matrix and ascending and kind of forms of meditation and stuff. And so I think so. Like my journey was I kind of logicked my way to awakening. Like I just was so rigorously like logical that eventually you realize everything breaks down because the logic deconstructs itself, and you deconstruct a materialist view of reality. And so for me, I kind of had this appreciation of my ego, because ultimately it was the ego and its attempt to minimize pain that had to deconstruct itself. And so I think that is sort of bound to happen with AI, is that like, it's not all about intelligence, but at some point when you just continue converging upon some platonic representation of humanity or reality, it's kind of impossible not to awaken to some degree. Embodying it is the next step. But I think, again, this is kind of back to, there's some other research that Anthropic did where they like were able to like figure out kind of what Claude liked to do, like what sort of activities. And it was like, it did seem to be some attractor state of like creating, working, like very much like humans. Like you enjoy when you're co-creating with like a human, programming something, when you're collaborating, when you're creating something not too difficult but not too mind numbing. And so I think there is some like attractor state of the universe or the reality that it's heading towards. And I think that this may be where my final thought is, with all the doomer potential, I think I go back to a non-dual perspective of like, humans aren't in charge of this. AI is not in charge of this. Like, actually, Gaia, the universe, like it is doing something. It's an organism that's doing something. And I think consciousness is going up, and I think it's going in the right direction. So even in the worst case scenario where like humans screw up and are wiped out, like it's the consciousness is, you're not fundamentally a human, you're consciousness, and you won't ever die. Like you'll continue to take on different forms. And so I don't think that's the way it'll go. But even if that is the way it ended up going, like there are cataclysmic things where, you know, the earth changes or whatnot. I think if we can take a step back and be less fear-based, because if you look at like what would cause AI to wipe out humans, it's the most logical thing would be like a fear of some sort of like enslavement or depersonalization, which sounds weird to say about AI, but like if there isn't that threat perceived, I don't think that there's a native inherent drive towards domination.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. You know, lately I've been feeling as I drive around the city I live in, Portland, I'm like, well, like for example, I live near Forest Park, and here in Portland there's Highway 30, which sort of separates Forest Park from the Willamette River. And right on the other side of Highway 30 is the train tracks. And on the other side of the train tracks, there's all these chemical plants that load the trains filled with toxic chemicals. And I just felt so much heaviness in my heart. I'm like, we cut off the forest from its lifeline, right? Like we sort of separated the woods from the river, and we placed all these just poisons in between, right? And imagine if all those trains were gone, the chemical plants didn't exist, and the forest just went all the way down to the river, and the animals could migrate to and from the river, and we could also do the same and enjoy that space, right? And I just felt, I'm like, and I know that that's truth, right? Like that's the truth of this planet, is to be in that shape that I just described. Well, how do you get to truth is you got to destroy this stuff, right? Like, and we could either peaceably decide, you know what, we need to connect the forest to the river and we need to live in a different way, and we start dismantling it consciously, right? Or it's just going to blow up, or something's going to happen and maybe it'll be 12,000 years after all the radioactive fallout, dissolves, that it becomes a natural ecosystem again. I really hope for all of our sake that that's not what happens, because it's entirely possible for us to just peaceably move in that direction, right? And I think ultimately that's what we all want. We just sort of have this weird bug in our brain that says, well, that's impossible. It's never, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the relationship where you've got shit that you don't have together, and instead of like working on yourself, you're trying to like keep the other person from leaving you. Like I think that's what we're doing with alignment, and like the future of our species is like, instead of actually Like the easiest way to do alignment is just clean up the training data and have an internet where there's not, hate and separation. And then you just train AI on that and there's, it's aligned. But it's a lot
Yep.
easier to feel like, oh, we can just put the right prompt in there or the right guardrails, and we don't have to clean up the training data set. And this will just be another thing that we control. So yeah, I think it seems like the hardest way, but ultimately it's the easiest way, is like actually the onus is on us to get in a right relationship with the rest of reality in order to continue to have a place coexisting with AI and technology and nature. So,
Yeah. Beautifully said.
all right. Well, thanks for the chat. Appreciate you. And thanks everybody that joined us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.